National Nancy's, the fourth in the Alex Reynolds Mysteries. Author Fred Hunter, St. Martin's Press, New York, 2000. Narrator Eric Aust. Chapter 14. Mother, Peter, and I had hoped to be able to stay in bed very, very late, since having our sleep interrupted 2 nights in a row by attempts on our lives had left us feeling rather flat, as Mother put it, but it was not to be. Agent Henry and Agent Raymond showed up on our doorstep at 9 o'clock Sunday morning, 1 week to the day since Charles Clark's office was destroyed. They were insistent enough about the doorbell that we decided they weren't going to go away, so Peter and I donned our bathrobes and trundled down the stairs to let them in. Mother followed not long after, apparently having forgotten to care about what the neighbors might think if they saw her receiving G-men in her bedclothes. Even with little more than 4 hours sleep, she managed to look fresh and well-rested. As she flowed down the stairs in an elaborate virginal white dressing gown, she looked like she was on her way to atomize the boudoir, rather than being questioned by the feds. We explained to the agents what had really happened the previous night, or most of it. We told them that Schuler had admitted to killing Jody because she'd found out that he'd made videotapes of himself having sex and was insisting that he resign, and that Schuler had tried to kill us because he mistakenly thought we knew about the tapes too, all of which was true. But we didn't tell them that Mary Lynn Hayden had put us on the scent of the tapes to begin with, or that Ned Turner had been the one to verify their existence and claim he could get hold of one. We figured there was no point in causing trouble for anyone else. We also didn't tell the agents about the tape we had. Henry and Raymond left only partly satisfied. It's possible they didn't believe us, but I suspect they were disappointed that the case had been cleared by a pair of Nancy boys and the Queen Mother. When they'd gone, we retired to the kitchen and Mother made some tea. None of us was hungry. "I wonder why he didn't kill Mary," Peter said once we were situated around the table. "Huh? Mary Lynn Hayden. I wonder why Schuler didn't kill her. I would have thought he'd believed she'd be the first one Jody would tell. What was on the tape?" I took a sip of tea. "My guess is that he figured Jody wouldn't tell anybody, not even Mary, what was on it until she was sure of it, and apparently she didn't. Remember, Mary assumed it was a tape of the Republican candidate, just like we did. It also would have looked awfully suspicious if Mary had been killed right away. It would have proved to the feds that Jody and Mary were the targets rather than Clark's campaign." "Do you really think Jody didn't tell Mary about something so important?" Mother asked. "I think that's exactly the kind of relationship they had. Mary was really the little woman in it. She's like one of those housewives from the 50s who doesn't know anything about paying the bills or the checking account or anything. Jody took care of everything. I don't think Jody would have told Mary anything upsetting, at least not until she had to. And Schuler must have known the dynamics of their relationship," said Peter. "He worked closely enough with them." We quietly drank our tea for a while. Then Mother set her mug on the table and cleared her throat. "Well, darlings, we have to decide what to do with that tape." Peter looked across the table at me. "You know how I feel about outing people, especially in a case like this. We don't know what that tape means. It could have been a one-time thing. He could have been experimenting. It could have just been his bad luck that he chose to experiment with that pig." I sighed heavily. I know. I can't use his sex life against him, at least not to out him. But I think we have to do something about him." Peter looked thoroughly surprised. "Why?" "There's a couple of things you've forgotten, and we can't overlook them." I explained what I meant. When I was done, Peter sat back in his chair. "You're right." I turned to Mother. "And we're not exactly welcome in the Clark camp, so we're going to need your help." It wasn't until later Sunday morning that news of John Schuler's death hit the airwaves, creating the sensation that one would expect. Reporters speculated on what reason he might have had for committing suicide and on what his death might mean to the Clark campaign. This naturally led the news people to the next logical step in the story: Clark's chances of winning the Democratic nomination. They already had results showing Clark had risen even higher in the polls in the few hours since news of Schuler's death had broken. It seemed Clark was rising on a ladder of dead bodies. We decided to wait until Monday after we'd been able to get some rest to put our plan into action. Monday was the day before the primary, and the Clark campaign moved into the Piedmont Hotel on South Michigan Avenue to prepare for the big day. Mother, Peter, and I took a cab to the hotel late in the morning. We paid off the driver and walked briskly through one of the building's oversized revolving doors. Like many of the city's older hotels, the Piedmont has a sort of faded allegiance that no amount of upgrading can completely erase. The lobby is full of marble statues, mostly nudes, discreetly covering the naughty bits, and a thick red carpet that seems to unfurl as you walk on it. Down a short hall to the right of the entrance is the grand ballroom, which would be the site of Clark's victory celebration. The doors stood open, and there was a flurry of activity inside. "Why don't we try there first?" I suggested. Mother shrugged, and we went down the hallway. The grand ballroom was not quite so large as I'd expected, but it would look impressive on television. Hotel staff, all dressed in identical white shirts and black pants, were setting up tables and chairs and testing the sound system. Some of Clark's volunteers were busy decorating the room with huge red, white, and blue banners. Apparently, they learned from footage of Peterson's rallies. "What are you doing here?" Sean Stillman demanded as he bustled up to us. He was in his shirt sleeves, clipboard in hand, and looked frazzled. "Hello, Sean. This is my mother," I said. "I'm pleased to meet you," he replied falteringly. He seemed rather nonplussed to have his question met with an introduction. He turned back to me. "What are you doing here?" "We're here to see Clark." "You've got to be kidding. The day before the primary, haven't you caused enough trouble? They told me you weren't supposed to be anywhere near the campaign anymore." "We need to talk to him about John Schuler," said Peter. Sean's face fell. "John? Isn't it unbelievable? Suicide! Jesus!" "We were there when it happened," I said, "and we need to talk to Clark about it. Do you know where he is?" He looked at Mother, then back at me. "What's going on?" "It's important, Sean." He closed his eyes and shook his head. "I don't think I want to know what's going on." His eyes slid open. "Charlie should be up in his suite. It's number 1407. But I don't think you'll be able to get in." "Thanks." We were going back down the hallway to find the elevators when my attention was caught by movement in a small alcove that gave way to the bathrooms. Two men were locked in a very passionate kiss. I stopped in my tracks when I saw who it was. "Mickey!" I exclaimed. Mother and Peter came to a halt beside me. The two men broke from their embrace and looked out at us. "Oh, hi, guys," he said with his usual effervescence. "You know Joe, don't you?" Joe Gardner pulled away from him slightly and blushed as he mumbled a greeting. "Looks like Ann Landers was right," Mickey continued. "I volunteered to try and find a man, and it looks like I got what I was looking for." Joe rolled his eyes, only for the first time it was with amused weariness. "I'll make him politically aware yet." "Nice to see you," I said mechanically. Then we continued down the hall and left the lovebirds to it. "I don't believe it," I said. "Mickey Downs and Joe Gardner? Those are the last people I expected to see together. I thought they hated each other." "You know how weird mating rituals can be," said Peter. "But what about that kiss that Joe gave Tony Milano at the party? That was only a few days ago." Peter considered this for a moment, then burst out laughing. "We really are idiots." "What?" "You remember he looked over at us, and we thought he wanted to make sure we were watching." "Yeah." "Think about it, Alex. What were we doing when he did that?" It took an effort to recall the scene, but it finally came to me. "Talking to Mickey." Peter nodded. "Right. Joe must have been trying to make him jealous." "God, I'm glad we're not that young anymore," I exclaimed. I don't think we ever were. The elevators were on the opposite side of the lobby from the grand ballroom. We rode up to the 14th floor to the accompaniment of a Muzak version of Rhythm Nation. When we stepped off the elevator, there was no doubt about which suite was 1407. There was an armed guard sitting on a chair to the left of the door. "Well, Mother, do your stuff," I whispered. She looked down her regal nose at me. "This won't require stuff, dear." We went down the hall to the guard, who got up as we approached, bringing with him a legal pad that had been sitting beside his chair. "We're here to see Mr. Clark," said Mother. "Names," the guard replied. "My name is Gene Reynolds. My son Alex, and Peter Livesey." He glanced over at us as if he'd heard the names before. He wasn't sure, then looked down at his pad. "I don't have your names here." "Could you tell Mr. Clark that I want to see him?" "He's not seeing anyone who's not on the list." "Oh, he'll see me," said Mother. "I'm British." The guard's brow furrowed, and for a time he looked as if he thought her reasoning should make sense to him. He started to say something else, but Mother cut him off. "If you could just tell him that we're here. He knows who we are. Tell him we would like to speak to him about John Schuler." He stared at her a little longer, then turned and went into the suite. A moment later, he opened the door again and ushered us in. The living room was awash with people, some of whom I recognized, and some I didn't. Clark was in the middle of a little group of them around a low, round table by the window, pretending that he wasn't intensely interested in our presence. He could almost have made me believe he hadn't already been told we were about to come in. He made a show of noticing us for the first time, then came over and shook our hands. "Hello, hello," he said in that open-faced way that had made him so popular with the people. Well, I'd be lying if I didn't say I was surprised to see you. I thought we'd made it fairly clear where we all stood at our last meeting." I glanced over his shoulder and saw his wife, Wendy, sitting on a pink satin chair in a corner of the room. Her hands were folded in her lap, and she was looking over at us wearily. "We'd like to speak to you in private," said Mother. "It's very, very important, and it's about John Schuler." There was a split second of silence before he said, Yes, follow me." He led us into the bedroom, in which a few people were standing by the dresser holding a huddled conversation. He asked them to leave, then closed the door behind them. "It was tragic about John. Just tragic," said Clark, not managing to meet any of our eyes. "It's a sad thing. I don't know what I'll do without him." "Really?" I said. "I would think you'd be relieved." He looked up sharply. "I don't know why you say that. John might have had his faults, but he was a good friend." He paused, staring at me as if daring me to challenge him, and then he softened somewhat. "The men from the FBI talked to me yesterday. I know as you do that John didn't really commit suicide, and I can't tell you how sorry I am that he dragged you into whatever he was doing. Despite our friendship, I have to admit that he was a very troubled young man. I don't know exactly what he was up to or why he would make an attempt on your life the way he did, but I want you to know how sorry that I am that I have, in however small a way, been the cause of your having come into a dangerous position. Until that moment, I don't think I ever realized just how quickly your opinion of someone can change. If he had fessed up to his own part in it right then and there, I think I could have almost forgiven him." "Mother," I said. She reached into her shoulder bag, pulled out the video cassette, and threw it into the bed. The black plastic case lay there like a dark blot against the stark white coverlet. Clark glared at it with bugged-out eyes as if he recognized it for the next bomb that would explode in his campaign. "We've watched this," said Mother. It made very interesting viewing. He cleared his throat and raised his head, although once again he found it difficult to look any of us in the eye. "You have to understand." "Drop out of the race," I said simply. There was a shocked silence. "What?" "Drop out of the race." He pointed at the tape. "Because of that? I would think you of all people would understand." "You don't understand," I said, cutting him off again. "We don't care. We don't care about your sex life, but you need to drop out of the race." Sweat started to pour off him at such a rate that you could feel the humidity in the room go up. "You can't mean that. You don't realize the amount of good I can do for your people." "Our people?" said Peter. Clark ignored him. "One indiscretion doesn't... Whatever faults I might have, I think they're far outweighed by the good that I can do." "Thanks. But we don't need you. There are other Democratic candidates." "But nobody that's as much on your side as I am." I couldn't believe it. Even Clark thought that gay rights was our only issue. I was getting tired of Joe Gardner being proven right. "They'll do," I intoned. "You don't get it, do you?" This isn't about your sex life. I wouldn't care if you were breaking into Lincoln Park and fucking monkeys if that's what made you happy. That's not what we're talking about here. He looked thoroughly confused and, for once, frightened. What? What are we talking about? Two things, said Peter. Someone has already been able to blackmail you to get you to act. That makes you more dangerous than you're worth if you were to get into office. Someone else could come up with a copy of this tape. I want you to vote their way, and what would that mean? Suddenly, you'd forget all the promises you made to our people. That's not true, he protested lamely. It was one thing with John. I knew him, but nobody else has this tape. You could just forget about it. It would be like it never existed. But we couldn't forget about Jody, said Mother. Jody? He tried hard to look like he didn't know what was coming, but the effort it was taking made him transparent. What about her? You knew that Schuler killed her, said Peter. Clark turned on him. No, I didn't. Of course you did, I said. You might not have known at first. You might have honestly thought the bombing was done by some run-of-the-mill terrorist. And the ironic part is that her death helped your campaign in more ways than one. You're doing wonderfully well at the polls, Mother interjected sardonically. But you knew later. You knew after the attempt was made on our lives. That's when you knew it was Schuler, didn't you? How could I know that? Because of the tape, said Peter. You knew it was Schuler the minute you heard we'd asked about the tape. How would I have known about the tape? I sighed. Because Schuler told you. Clark's face froze. How do you know that? You see, Jody didn't know that you were on one of the videotapes until Schuler told her. All she knew was that he'd made tapes of himself and other guys, and she wanted him to resign. We found out that her death had something to do with a video, but we thought it was a tape of Fritz Peterson. When we asked Schuler about it, he mistakenly believed that we were confronting him about that tape. I pointed to the one on the bed. That doesn't mean I know about any of this, Clark said angrily. Right after we talked to him, he made a beeline for your office. At the time, we thought he was just going to fill you in on what we'd said. But it was more than that. He knew there was only two people on Earth who knew about that particular tape. You and him. And he knew he hadn't told us. Clark looked down at the floor. You're very observant, aren't you? We keep our eyes and ears open, said Peter. He went to your office and accused you of having told somebody, didn't he? Clark didn't answer. It doesn't matter whether you confirm it or not, I said. Because when Schuler threatened to kill us, he said that he knew that you hadn't told us. As if I would, Clark said quietly. He was crazy. He thought he was just crazy. Peter picked up the story. You might have only suspected before, but when the FBI told you about the attempt on our lives, you knew Schuler had done it. There was a very long silence, then Clark slowly sat on the edge of the bed. I should have stopped it all, he said weakly. I should have stopped it all the minute he showed me that videotape. Yes, you probably should have, said Mother. I should have known it was all over, but it didn't seem fair. It didn't seem fair that my whole career should end before it started, just because Now you know how we feel, I said. He looked up. I didn't know it was John, really. You suspected, he shook his head. Not at first. I had no idea he had anything to do with Jody, but when I heard about you, I suspected. I didn't know. What was I supposed to do? Tell the FBI that I thought my campaign manager might be a murderer? I didn't have any facts to go by, and doing it would have ruined me. I sighed. It didn't sound much different than our reluctance to report anyone's behavior to the FBI, but this went beyond that. But you had to have done more than suspect when someone tried to kill us, right after we asked about a tape, said Peter. He nodded, finally conceding the point. Nobody else knew about the tape, just me and John. He sounded supremely sad, as if something other than his career had just been ruined. But I still didn't know anything for sure. It would be a lot easier for me to believe you if it wasn't for that elaborate charade you and John played out for us in your office when you fired us. You acted surprised when we told you Schuler had known what Jody was doing. And then the two of you acted out that little scene when you confronted him. You're a very plausible liar, Mr. Clark. He looked up at me. But that's all over now. John is gone. There's nobody else who can blackmail me. And there's still so much good I can do. You're forgetting about us, said Mother. His face hardened. So you're planning to blackmail me now? I looked down at him. You can walk away without ever having this indiscretion of yours exposed with your family and your dignity. I hadn't meant to stumble on the word, but I couldn't help it. I couldn't think of another to use, and that one caught in my throat. Your dignity intact, without anyone ever knowing, but you have to leave the race. I don't care how you live your life in private, but I won't have you as our representative in public. Your judgment is impaired. Don't you see that? You've betrayed us already. Heck, not just us, everyone. You can easily say that you're backing out because it's become too dangerous, Mother said helpfully, and that you don't want to endanger your family, both of which would be true, by the way, or that it has simply become too much for you, with 2 of your workers dead. There isn't a caring human being in the state who wouldn't understand and feel for you. But whatever you do, I said, you'll have to drop out. If you don't, we'll use the tape. There didn't seem to be anything more to say on our part, and the once articulate Clark no longer looked capable of speech. On our way out the door, I gestured at the tape and added, by the way, you can keep that one. We made copies. We were fortunate enough to get an elevator to ourselves on the way down. You know what really, really pisses me off, I said. When the media gets hold of the real story on Schuler, it'll make us all look bad. The religious Reich will have a field day. The religious Reich? Peter said with surprise. You're beginning to sound like Jody. She had her good points, I said after a beat. I don't think you have to worry about what'll happen, Peter replied. Everyone thinks Schuler committed suicide. When Ned Turner outs him, as he's sure to do now that Schuler is dead, everyone will know that the truth about Schuler was imminent and chalk it up to another case of the pressures placed on gays to stay in the closet. Mother sighed deeply. Isn't it awful? Would you really have used that tape? Said Peter. Nah, of course not. You sounded awful convincing. I smiled. For all you know, I could have meant we'd use it as a marital aid. As if we ever needed one. The elevator doors opened at the lobby and we stepped off. Well, that certainly made for an interesting morning, said Mother. I'm famished. Why don't I take us all out for the biggest and best lunch we can find? Any place but at this hotel, I said. I'd love it, said Peter. As we approached the revolving doors, Mother said, Oh, by the way, did I tell you that Simon called yesterday? He's not going to be able to stay on after all. His company's called him back to London. Really? I said. Yes, isn't that a shame? I had such a good time with him. I'll miss him. Will you really? Oh, yes. He was great fun to be with, and he really knew how to treat a lady, which you can't say of a lot of men these days. She paused and sighed. If only he hadn't been such a gigolo. I stopped abruptly. You knew about him? She looked at me as if I'd slipped a cog. She drew her pursed lips to one side, eyed me affectionately, and said, Oh, Alex, really? She then dove into the revolving door. Peter and I were a few steps behind her, as usual. A Gay Mysteries audiobooks. I think it is easy to hate a label, but a face humanizes the word. So this effort is twofold. To offer comfort to those like myself that your world didn't end because you don't fit into the view of acceptable society on both sides. And in hopes of helping those with family that are LGBTQ, that it doesn't mean we are aliens from the child they once knew. Reassure them so they can maybe be supportive at the same time, being true to their values.